There was once a man named Vittorio de Rinaldi, a political advisor and rhetorician who lived in a crumbling estate on the edge of Florence. His name was known by few, feared by fewer, and truly understood by almost none. What made Vittorio peculiar was not the sharpness of his wit nor the severity of his gaze, but the curious book he had read hundreds of times, Il Principe, by Niccolò Machiavelli. He had not read it for power, nor for political gain. No, Vittorio read it for something stranger. He read it to understand respect more precisely, how to command it, especially from women who, for all their beauty and mystery, had always eluded his sense of control. In a life where others yielded before titles and coins, women did not. And so he turned to strategy. Vittorio's theory was simple. To be respected by a woman, one must be sovereign over oneself. He interpreted Machiavelli not as a mere manual for ruling others, but as a mirror for ruling the soul. Be feared rather than loved, he whispered to himself often, though he came to realize that fear was not cruelty, but clarity. It was presence. It was a man standing so firm in his being that no whim could move him. And so he began to act. Accordingly, he stopped apologizing for existing. Where once he filled silences with nervous explanations, he now allowed them to stretch like velvet between sentences. He didn't rush to please. He did not explain why he left a gathering early, nor why he stared too long at the stars instead of into another's eyes. He became deliberate, like a blade being drawn, not to threaten, but to remind. He treated compliments like coin rarely given, but when they were, they had weight. He didn't flatter beauty, for he knew it was often flattery that diluted truth. Instead, when he spoke of a woman's grace, he did so as if speaking to a queen, not a desire. One evening, at a salon crowded with poets and diplomats, Vittorio met Isabella Vernazza, a philosopher disguised as a noblewoman. She saw through him quickly, not in a dismissive way, but as if reading the footnotes of a familiar book. "You do not seek affection," she said, lifting her glass of amber wine to her lips. "You seek reverence." Vittorio smiled. "And you believe that unworthy?" "No," she said, leaning closer. "Only rare. Tell me, have you earned your own reverence first?" It was a dagger of a question, gently plunged. Vittorio did not answer right away. Machiavelli had taught him that delay could be a weapon too. "I earn it," he said finally each day. "I choose not to betray myself." Isabella's gaze did not soften. It deepened. She was not charmed. She was intrigued. And for Vittorio, that was more valuable. The weeks passed, and word of him traveled. Women who once dismissed his name now leaned into his words, not because he was loud, but because he was unshakably still. He had no need to prove. He had nothing to hide. They respected him not for what he gave, but for what he did not surrender, his center. And yet, as the respect of others grew, so too did Vittorio's isolation. For to be truly sovereign is to be lonely. He realized that being respected was not the same as being known. Respect could be earned through posture and presence, but intimacy required something far more dangerous: vulnerability. Machiavelli had no chapter on that. One night, as Florence slept under a heavy moon, Vittorio returned to his estate and stood. Before a mirror, he studied his reflection, the deliberate lines of his suit, the unflinching eyes, and, for a moment, he saw the scaffolding beneath. The boy who once begged to be noticed, the lover who feared being left, the man who sought control because the world had once denied him agency, and he asked himself, is respect without love enough? But there was no answer, only silence, his oldest ally. Then a letter arrived. It was sealed with dark wax, the emblem of a raven perched upon a crown. Isabella's seal. Inside, only a single sentence: "If you are ready to be ruled as much as you rule, meet me where the stars do not hide." Vittorio read it 3 times. He understood now that to be respected was only half the throne. The other half required kneeling. It's not in submission, but in mutual recognition. He folded the letter, placed it against his chest, and for the first time in years, smiled not as a strategist, but as a man beginning to hope. The path ahead was no longer marked by steps of control, but by echoes of connection yet to come. Vittorio left at dawn. He didn't bring a servant, nor a guard. Only the letter and a leather-bound notebook that had accompanied him since his youth,
now worn
like the palms of his hands. He had no idea where Isabella's cryptic message would lead him, where the stars do not hide, but he knew instinctively it would not be a place on any map. It was a test, one Machiavelli would have admired, an invitation cloaked as a riddle, demanding intellect, vulnerability, and action. He traveled north, toward the mountains where the air grew thinner and the sky more honest. Cities became villages. Villages became whispers of stone. The people there spoke little and watched with ancient eyes. Vittorio didn't ask questions, he observed. A prince, even in exile, learns by silence. On the third night, he reached the edge of a high plateau where the earth fell away into a vast, starlit canyon. It was there, under the open sky, that he understood the meaning of her words. Here, the stars did not hide. There was no haze, no lamplight, no ceiling of illusion. Only the truth of the cosmos, fierce and undeniable. And she was waiting. Isabella stood beside a small fire, her hair loose, her cloak heavy against the cold. She did not smile at his arrival, nor did she speak. She merely gestured for him to sit. He did. They watched the flames in silence. Not a silence of discomfort, but one of recognition. It's the kind that only exists between people who have both suffered and refused to be ruined by it. Finally, she spoke. "You've read Machiavelli like a prayer." "I've read him like a manual," Vittorio corrected. "No, you've worshipped him," she said. "You've built your house upon his bones." He did not deny it. Isabella turned toward him fully. "And has it made you free?" This question, struck differently, it wasn't a challenge, it was a key. It unlocked something in Vittorio he hadn't dared examine, the cost of his philosophy. The solitude disguised as strength. The admiration that never ripened into love. The power that brought no peace. "I've been safe," he answered. She nodded, yes, and alone. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw in her not just the wisdom of a rival mind, but the courage of a heart that had not abandoned itself. She was sovereign too, but in a way he had not yet mastered. Her strength was not built upon stone walls, but woven through her ability to be seen without armor. "I thought respect would protect me," he said softly. "And it did," she said, "from the world, but not from yourself." Vittorio closed his eyes. The fire cracked. The stars above bore witness. He remembered being 17, chasing applause in university salons. 23, watching his first love walk away because he had refused to say what he truly felt. 35, rich in intellect but bankrupt in intimacy. All those years mastering the art of being impressive yet unknown. "I am tired," he confessed. Isabella reached forward and took his hand. It was not a romantic gesture. It was ceremonial. "Then let us begin," she said. That night they did not kiss. They did not touch again. They simply shared their stories, the ones that hurt, the ones that healed, the ones never told to anyone else. They dismantled the architecture of strategy and replaced it with the fragile beams of honesty. In the days that followed, Vittorio wrote less in his notebook and listened more. He asked questions not to impress, but to understand, and women once, enchanted by his presence, now began to trust him, not because he was powerful, because he was real. He did not abandon Machiavelli. No, but he reinterpreted him. He saw now that power without soul was tyranny. Even in personal relationships, that being feared could never replace being respected. And that true respect comes only when one dares to reveal their entire self. Even the parts unplugged, Isabella stayed, not as a conquest, but as a witness, and together they began teaching. Others not with speeches, but with presence, not with arguments, but with questions. They spoke in gatherings where people had forgotten how to be sincere. They reawakened a forgotten truth, that respect is not commanded. It is offered by those who recognize the courage it takes to remain undone. And so, the story did not end, because they were no longer interested in endings. Only in what begins when the performance is over. Spring came late to the mountains even. As April painted the lowlands in green, the high plateau where Vittorio and Isabella had made their temporary home remained stubbornly silent, suspended between frost and fire. Yet in that silence, something rare began to take root. Not love as the poets sang of it, with its tempestuous declarations and aching distance. No, this was love as philosophers dream it might be. Lucid, anchored, forged in the furnace of mutual awakening, was a companionship stripped of spectacle, formed in shared silences and questions asked without fear of the answers. They never defined what they were to each other. That would have felt too small, too brittle. Instead, they defined how they would be with each other, each morning a new negotiation of presence, each night a quiet audit of the soul. They became, in a sense, scholars of the human condition, using their bond as the case study. Others began to arrive. First, a former diplomat from Siena, disillusioned by courts, but still hungering for purpose. Then a young widow from Rome, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw too much. Soon, artists, writers, wanderers, and thinkers made the climb not to find answers, but to learn how to live inside the questions, Vittorio called it. La Tour de l'Umbroth, the Tower of Shadow. Not because it was dark, but because it was a place where the shadow self, the hidden, the shameful, the deeply human was not exiled, but welcomed. Here people were not instructed in tactics, but invited into truth. The Machiavellian became not a mask, but a mirror. And Vittorio, once the architect of manipulation, had become a guide of reclamation. In the evenings they gathered around the fire to share. Not accomplishments, not philosophies, but stories. Wounds, mostly. Regrets left unspoken for decades. The things they were too proud to admit in public, but too weary to carry alone. One night, as snow began to fall again in May, Isabella stood before them and read from an unfinished letter she had written to her younger self. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. You will be told to smile more, to bend, to soften, to avoid being alone. You will try, and you will fail, and that failure will be your freedom. One day a man will look at you and not flinch from your fire. He will not try to put it out, will simply sit beside it, warmed but unburned. Wait for that man, or become him yourself. When she finished, no one applauded. They simply listened. As one listens to rain after a drought, Vittorio wept quietly that night, not from sorrow, but from release. The kind of tears that come when something unspoken is finally seen. That same week, he burned his old notebooks. Not all of them, but the ones filled with strategies on how to impress, how to dominate, how to bend perception. He watched the smoke rise and imagined it forming into the shape of his old self. Beautiful, impressive, hollow. And then he walked into the library they had built together, took a fresh journal, and wrote, "Respect is not earned through distance. It is given through courage. And courage is the art of standing fully naked emotionally, spiritually, without retreating. Begin again." They never sought to publish. What they built was not for the masses, yet it was for the few willing to descend into themselves and rise without masks. And so the tower grew not in size, but in depth. One morning, a girl of 16 arrived alone. She had walked for 3 days from a village where no one had ever spoken her name with kindness. She asked only one question. "Will I be safe here?" Vittorio answered gently, "No, but you will be seen, and in time that is the safest thing of all." And the fire burned on. The tower remained, not a monument to power, nor a haven for the broken, but a living organism, constantly shedding, evolving, returning. Its stones, once bare, were now covered in ivy and the fingerprints of countless seekers. Every room bore marks of human presence, scribbled verses in candlelit corners, faded footprints on wooden floors, silent echoes of laughter and grief. It was no longer just Vittorio. In Isabella's home it was a soul sanctuary. Vittorio had grown older, and though his shoulders carried less arrogance and more time, his presence had only deepened. His eyes, once weapons of rhetoric, had become wells of listening. The man who had once sought to conquer the world with silence now used it to hold others gently. making space for truths too fragile for noise. Isabella remained his axis. Not a wife, not in the legal sense, but something far more sacred, a chosen witness to his becoming. Their love was not defined by possession nor bound by ritual. It was a dialogue, unfolding wordlessly each day, shaped not by declarations, but by devotion. One winter, as the wind howled against the mountain and the snow fell heavy, Vittorio fell ill. It was not sudden. His body had been whispering its exhaustion for months. The life he had lived, the inner wars, the endless restraint, the burdens of reinvention had taken their toll, and now his breath came slower. His bones ached deeper. He did not resist. He welcomed it like an old adversary turned friend, around his bedside. Those who had lived and grown under his guidance gathered, former skeptics, now teachers, former pretenders, now poets. They came not to mourn, but to listen to him one last time. Vittorio, his voice thin but steady, spoke not of legacy. He spoke of surrender. We spend our youth fearing vulnerability, thinking it will make us weak. So we build fortresses, we dress in theories, we wield cleverness like swords. And in doing so, we forget that what makes us most human, is the very thing we try to hide, our need to be known and still chosen. He paused, coughing lightly. Then looked to Isabella. I spent years trying to earn respect. Now I understand. I only ever needed to forgive myself. Isabella wept then, not from sorrow, but from recognition. He had arrived. Finally, fully. And in that moment, as the wind stilled outside and time seemed to slow, something shifted. Vittorio did not die, not yet. Instead, he slept, and when he woke the next morning, it was spring again. As if the mountain itself had waited for his transformation to complete before releasing the thaw, he recovered slowly. But he no longer led the gatherings. Others did. Those he had once guided now became guides. The tower became less a place to listen to Vittorio and, more, a place to listen to oneself. He spent his days in the garden, writing letters to people who would never receive them. Letters to his past selves. To the boy who felt invisible. To the young man desperate to be. Admired to the strategist who mistook control for love. And he burned each letter after writing it, as if sending it skyward. One evening, sitting beside Isabella under a canopy of stars, he asked, "Do you think Machiavelli ever felt loved?" Isabella tilted her head. "He understood power, but I don't. Think he trusted love, then perhaps." Vittorio said, "That is the difference we were born to make." And with that, they fell into silence once more. Not the kind born from absence, but the sacred silence that exists between two souls who have finally arrived, not at dominance, not even at wisdom, but at peace. The fire inside the tower glowed quietly behind them. The world outside still roared, with noise and conquest, but within these walls, a new order had taken root, one not ruled by fear, nor by masks, but by the fierce, unshakable clarity of presence. And so the story continued, not in chapters, but in lives. The tower, now more myth than location, had begun to echo far beyond its mountain. It had no name in official documents, no maps pointed to it, and yet its legend had rooted itself in the minds of those who had glimpsed it, even briefly. Whispers in academic halls spoke of the sanctuary where people unlearned the world. Artists painted it from memory. Dreamers wrote letters to it they never mailed, but change inevitable, quiet. Persistent had begun to stir. The world outside was growing louder, louder in ambition, louder in pretense. A new wave of thinkers and influencers claimed the legacy of Machiavelli without understanding its marrow. They spoke of manipulation as mastery, of dominance as destiny, of respect as a commodity to be traded, not lived. Vittorio, now white-haired and slower in step, watched this unfold with a gaze no longer heavy with disdain, but with sorrow. Old hunger had returned to the world, the need to be seen as powerful instead of being true. One morning, a group of young aspirants arrived, They wore expensive simplicity and spoke in aphorisms. They had read Il Principe, quoted it fluently, and came seeking validation for their interpretations. Vittorio listened. He listened as they spoke of leverage, of image control, of calculated charisma, and then he asked only one question. What have you allowed yourself to need? They blinked, confused. Power is a shelter, he continued. But if it's built to protect you from needing anything from being seen, being wrong, being small, then it is not strength, it is fear-wearing. A crown. One among them, a young man named Matteo, stayed behind after the others left. He was quiet, uncertain. That night, Vittorio found him outside the tower, crying not from shame, but from a deep exhaustion. I don't know how to be anyone without the performance, Matteo confessed. Vittorio placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture light, but grounding. Then you're ready to begin. And so Matteo stayed. He worked in the gardens, read in the evenings, and slowly began writing not for others, but for himself. He burned his journals weekly, not to erase, but to surrender. He became the next guide, and Vittorio finally stepped back completely. He and Isabella moved to a smaller cottage beneath the plateau. There, they lived in deep quietude, surrounded by wildflowers and wind. They no longer felt the need to speak their truths aloud. They had become the truth simply by being. Vittorio spent his final years writing a single book, one that he never titled. It was not a treatise, nor a manifesto. It was not advice. It was simply a collection of reflections, each one a question. He believed deeply that questions endured, while answers calcified. Among the final pages, he wrote, "If I am remembered, let it not be for the strategies I taught, but for the moments I dared to say, I do not know. But I will stay with you in the not knowing." When Vittorio passed, he did so without ceremony. No grave was built, no funeral held. Isabella scattered his ashes on the wind that passed. Through the canyon where they had first met, in his place, the tower endured. Not just in stone, but in the hearts of those who had unlearned their defenses within its walls. They returned to the world not with armor, but with awareness. They carried a quiet rebellion, to lead without dominance, to speak without performance, to love without fear. And so, somewhere in the hills where the stars do not hide, the fire still burns, and the path to the tower remains, not marked by signs, but by the courage to remove one's mask and begin again. The story did not end with Vittorio's death. In truth, it began again subtler, quieter, but with roots deeper than even he could have foreseen. Matteo, once the most reluctant of learners, had grown into a presence all his own. Not a replica of Vittorio, not an echo, but a new voice formed in the crucible of doubt. He taught differently, less like a philosopher and more like a gardener seeding questions and allowing them to grow in the silence of others. He spoke. Rarely, but when he did, he asked, "Where do you still pretend?" And in that space, many broke open. But with growth came consequence. More people came to the tower to many. What had once been a sanctuary became, slowly, a symbol. Symbols attract interpretation. Some came to be transformed. Others came to be seen being transformed. Ego, subtle and patient, began to creep back into the cracks. Matteo felt it first. The gatherings were louder, the rituals performed, confessions curated. He found himself missing the days when a single person arriving with sincerity was worth more than 100 with expectations. One night, he walked to the old garden where Vittorio used to sit. He found Isabella there, older now, her beauty untouched. By time, because it was never based on appearance, it was in her awareness. Her stillness. "I think we must end it," Matteo said. Isabella turned toward him, neither surprised nor alarmed. "No, but you must let it die." He blinked. "What's the difference? Ending something is an act of control. Letting it die is an act of faith. And so they let the tower die, not in fire, not in exile, but in relinquishment." They stopped. Accepting new seekers, they gave no explanations. Those who understood stayed, but those who needed structure moved on. And like all sacred things, Once it was no longer available to the many. Its essence became purer among the few. Years passed again. The tower crumbled slowly, lovingly. Stones returned to earth. Ivy overtook its sharpest edges. Matteo and Isabella moved deeper into the forest, where they built a small house by a quiet river. They lived simply. They taught no more. But one day, decades later, a young girl appeared at their door. She was no older than 12. She said nothing, only handed Matteo a small notebook. It was one of Vittorio's long thought burned. Inside, a single phrase was scrawled in faded ink. The first sign of true power is the willingness to give it away. The girl looked up at Matteo and asked, "Is this place real?" Matteo smiled, the same tired but radiant smile Vittorio once wore. "It was," he said, "and now, maybe it can be again, not as a place, but as a way of being. Because in the end, the tower was never stone. It was a choice reborn in each moment we dare to live without performance, to respect without hierarchy, and to meet the world without needing to control it. And somewhere, quietly, the stars do not hide. The decision to finalize the story requires us to close not with a flourish, but with reflection." The tale of Vittorio. De Rinaldi was never about power in the political sense, nor was it a romance, though love whispered through every chapter. It was about the unmasking of a man, and through him, the dismantling of a belief system that had governed too many lives from the shadows. The tower, whether in its physical presence or its philosophical essence, was never a place it was an act of courage, a return, a reckoning. And in the final seasons of his life, Vittorio discovered that the deepest respect one can earn is not from others, but from oneself. A respect born not of status, achievement, or charisma, but from the gentle, unwavering decision to be fully human in a world that rewards performance. His legacy was never his name, nor the rituals of those who came after him. It was the seed he planted in Matteo, the breath he left in Isabella's silence, the space he made for the girl who wandered into a home no longer searching for disciples. He died once, yes, by the fire, under the sky, but he also died a second. Death, a more sacred one, the death of his image, of his control, of his need to be respected at all. And so he was reborn, not in body, but in every act of realness that followed him. In the garden where he once burned his notebooks, wildflowers now grow untamed, soft, unashamed, and when the wind moves just right through the mountains, it is said, you can still hear the question that defined his life. Where do you still pretend? The tower is gone, the fire is not. Because in the end, to be respected truly, one must first be willing to be seen completely. And only then do the stars refuse to hide.